3, 2, 1, and we're rolling. Here we go again. Today I'm with Jose Logarta, commonly known as Viking. Well, you can imagine I really like that name. You're a energy policy advisor with the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, short ICSC. Background is actually in chemical engineering and in economics. It's an interesting combination, by the way. You worked in the energy and environment sectors for more than 30 years already, so you're an old hand. Huh?
Also just old.
And also just old, well, that's not a bad thing per se. You have quite an extensive range of experiences, ranging from power plant operations, policy research and formulation, and you've developed numerous projects in the field of renewable energies. You've been a member of the board of the Philippine Small Hydro Association, and you were a partner in Asian Energy Advisors prior to joining ICSC. Well, I'm very glad to have you here on the show. It's an honor. But first of all, I gotta ask, how did you get that nickname, Viking?
Well, it's a long story. You ask my sisters.
Well, we have enough time.
Came from a movie, The Vikings, with Kirk Douglas in the 1960s.
All right, that sounds like there is some history attached to that name. That's great. Well, okay, I gave this brief introduction about you. Maybe you can just tell me a little bit, again in your own words, how did you get started, in the field of renewable energy and then also climate change related advocacy? How did your personal journey start in that field?
Well, my interest in energy really started in the 1970s when I was in high school. It was the first oil crisis after the Yom Kippur War of 1973. So there was an oil embargo, there was rationing of fuels in the country. You had to get a coupon to have your car filled and all that. So in chemistry and physics, all my projects were about energy. Yeah.
That's interesting. So that's like with the oil crisis in the 70s, and then how did it go from there?
I don't think I ever lost interest in energy issues.
80s, 90s?
Including in college, my thesis was about energy.
Interesting. And then after you finished university, you just started working in that field, or?
Yes, I used to work with the National Power Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm one of the very few guys, I guess, who are advocating RE, who has ever worked in a coal plant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is? I mean, this is already an interesting anecdote, no? So what did you learn from that experience? Besides getting a bit black in the face, I guess.
Well, it wasn't really like that. Many people don't know that one of the first ever coal plants we had here came from Romania.
Oh.
That's the work of the First Lady, the former First Lady. Yeah. Made friends with Ceausescu, and then an arrangement, they put a coal plant in Cebu.
Interesting. Is that one still there, or is it?
No, it's long been decommissioned. What I do remember is, aside from the corruption, because I was assigned in the laboratory to test fuels, lubes, and water.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the upstairs they were always interested in the coal analysis.
Okay.
So you get heating value, ash content, sulfur content, and some parameters had to be met before the supplier gets paid. So
Okay.
it speaks for itself.
There's enough room for manipulating. Yeah. Okay, and then so after you worked there, so how did it go in the 90s and early 2000s? I mean, like when did you become like an advocate for renewable energy, really? in the Philippines?
Yeah, to be honest, in the early 90s, when we had this power shortage, I worked for the Senate Energy and Environment Committees,
Okay.
but our main concern was really the outages. And sorry to say, but at that time, coal was the big bet for reliability. But we did also ask the DNR, especially the Environmental Management Bureau, to see to it that they all complied with the regulations. And at that time too, in environmental economics, when we would factor in GHG emissions, this is what we called we were advocating no regrets policies.
Okay.
Yeah, like energy efficiency. So if you introduce energy efficiency, you will reduce emissions of particulate matter, which has the more direct impact on health. And we would say that, well, if a side effect of that is we reduce emissions of GHG, then we will never regret this policy. So it was not GHG for its own sake.
I see. Okay, so you had like kind of this the background in science, obviously, as an engineer, but also you were quite early on involved in politics and the whole political side of things, right? And thirdly, you were also an economist. So how did this whole training come into play and serve you?
Well, life is short, so you do what you love doing.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm asking because right now, I mean, one of the core observations is that like renewable energy today, I mean, the core argument for it, and something that should convince also the critics, is that it's just the most economically feasible solution, no? But that wasn't always the case. So I mean, like so I would be interested in like knowing how this came about, and also like how this whole modeling, economic modeling, on the side of experts like yourself, how this played a role in convincing, hopefully, governments and the population that it's a good, but also like a cost-efficient way of producing energy.
Well, let's go to the 80s, 90s, when renewable energy was still so expensive. Especially even in the 90s, solar panels were at a pipe dream, something like that. Yeah. And so when people started getting concerned about GHG emissions, and in the marketplace, in the power market, the economic value of the externalities, the pollution, was not factored into the market price. So policymakers had two choices: whether you implement a Pigovian tax or a tax on pollution, so that the relative prices would shift in favor of renewables, or you give certain incentives to the RE developers. So at that time, RE was still so expensive, right? And so in the Philippine case, the policymakers decided they'd rather go for the incentives rather than a carbon tax, for example, which is the first best economic policy option as far as economics is concerned. But because of the political economy considerations, politicians always say, let's go for the incentives part.
Right.
So, a Renewable Energy Act was promulgated in December 2008, but the implementation took so long. And by that time already, we were already seeing these radical declines in RE technologies. So in the RE Act, one of the major measures there is the so-called feed-in tariff. That is already suspended, but that program has caused the installation of around 1 gigawatt. It's a significant number.
Right.
Unfortunately, in many fora, some people will blame the FIT for increasing power rates, but not really. It's less than 25 centavos at the moment, the cross subsidy. Yeah. The problem at that time was we opted for the tariff setting part. We opted for an administrative procedure instead of a competitive one like auctions. So, administrative procedure entailed the gathering of so much data on costs, capital costs, operating costs for solar, wind, run-of-river hydro, and biomass. Then given all those capital costs and projected operating costs, the regulator allowed for a certain rate of return. So that's how it was. So, I was a hydro guy at that time, and I can tell you that, developers would always pad their costs.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess that's a lesson. So if the FIT program reopens, then people now are aware that it should be through a competitive process, not through administrative accounting.
Right, right. So just to take a step back and also like to, trying to make all of this comprehensible to kind of a general audience. The idea, to me, what quickly happens when I join those kind of discussions is it gets very technical, like very quickly, which is kind of the nature of this matter, because it is, after all, a technical matter. You can't just kind of like talking about climate change or climate change mitigation or renewable energy and the shift to renewable energy and kind of like wishy-washy, pie in the sky in general terms. It doesn't help. You need to look at the nitty-gritty details, and you need to have obviously like a technical understanding of the implications. But could you still try in a very like in common words, just try to tell us, where do we stand today in the Philippines? What is we have this Renewable Energy Act, but it's not really being implemented efficiently. Or what is the main challenge that we're facing here today, and what is at stake? If we look at the next 2 decades or so.
Well, to begin with, the official policy coming from the Department of Energy is this thing called technology neutrality. So they're not, our energy department is not really hot about RE. He wants RE to compete. That can be done through regulation, but the RE Act said preferential option for clean energy, but we cannot force the secretary to abide by provisions of that law. So we still cooperate with them to fine-tune policies as they are. The argument that the energy people here don't really think that the Philippines has a large role to play in reducing emissions is because it's a usual argument that we're a developing country and we're not responsible for the accumulated mass of GHG emissions, so on and so forth. That's the argument. We are victims. And our counter-argument is that climate science tells us that the damage and perhaps irreversible damage does not depend on where the marginal ton of emissions comes from. It can come from Cebu, it can come from Berlin.
Right.
The climate doesn't care. And secondly, we are in that group of countries that account for less than 0.5% of emissions worldwide in the inventory. But if all those countries in that set that account for 20% of emissions have that kind of attitude, then we're all fucked.
Right. Won't go anywhere. Huh?
So even now, the Department of Finance is already, because of these cost reductions in RE, they're already contemplating removing the incentives.
Okay, and if we look at the consequences, I mean, like, okay, so on the one hand, the Philippines, as you said, is part of, you know, the larger global attempts, you know, to combat climate change and to shift to renewables. So, like, namely, the Paris Agreement would be the big framework, no? But, like, then on the other hand, there's a lot of concerns also in the country about, like, you know, keeping prices at a level where they are right now. Then, you know, like, this kind of brownouts is still a concern. So you have all those kind of arguments from politicians, and I think that, you know, also from the general population, which in my mind don't strike me as very well informed. So you know, if, for example, the cost argument isn't really true anymore, you know, then why doesn't the government decide, okay, look, this is just something we need to do? I mean, like, this is the smartest decision. So why are they kind of sticking with, you know, coal plants?
Well, I have to admit that there is a technical argument that is valid from that side. This the technical fact that variable renewable energy, wind and solar, because of the cost of batteries, we cannot yet rely on VRE to provide firm capacity. But in small island grids, hybridization with solar and wind, or even complete 100% RE with batteries is feasible. In the main grids, you can infuse variable renewable energy at, efficiently, economics-wise, only if you shave off the peaking part of the load curve.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that displaces some GHG. And then also there is this so-called, from the installations coming from the feed-in tariffs, we have observed this so-called merit order effect, that the infusion of VRE into the grid will, as analytically expected, it lowers the spot market prices.
Okay.
For the times when there's wind and there's sun.
Okay, so I mean, what does all of this? I mean, what does it translate into? Like, what would be, like, let's say, an optimistic scenario for the next 10 years? And what do you think, if things go well and somehow, you know, let's say battery prices get even lower and, like, the technology helps us, you know, to implement RE even more smoothly than it is today, and somehow, secondly, you have some kind of like political will to make this happen. What would be an optimistic scenario? And then question 2, what is a realistic scenario?
Okay, before I forget, I should write that down. But let's go back to the pre-restructuring days of the power sector.
Sure.
So we had this vertically integrated, state-owned, vertically integrated power company. National Power was responsible for almost all the generation and responsible for transmission. So at the time, the power development programs plan was really a plan because the state had the control lever, funds. So we broke that up starting in 2001 after the Electric Power Industry Restructuring Act, or EPIRA. So we unbundled transmission from generation, and then generation from distribution. But yeah, and the expectation was competition, because the state utility had amassed a lot of debt, which could no longer be paid on time, and there was no investable funds for new power plants. So the fiscal picture wasn't really good.
Okay.
So, and if I recall, the National Power Corporation was too leveraged. It's like 95% debt, 5% equity. So that was really unsustainable. So the expectation was to introduce competition. And right now the competition is still very limited. We have this, the demand side of the market is now classified into two. The contestable part and the captive part. Captive means households, people with low demand, and it's contestable. Right now, because of some Supreme Court decision, it's limited to an average annual peak demand of 1 megawatt. But that's still a lot. So in regard to your first question, what's the likely scenario? Business as usual? Yeah. BAU is difficult because of this dynamic trends in prices. So if you say BAU, so you have to consider all those things as well.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
So one scenario is that battery prices plummet further down, and VRE with batteries, and also pump storage and biomass will really displace natural gas, bunker, and coal. But we don't know when.
Yeah.
But the problem is power plant investments are so lumpy, right? And the projects would not materialize if you don't have a guaranteed stream of revenues. The banks won't finance it. So we have this legacy,
Right.
that because the banks won't finance it without bilateral contracts. Most of the power supply that goes through the utilities is through very long-term contracts, right? So when that point comes, when these thermal power plants that have lifespans of 30 to 50 years, debt repayment schedules of 15 years, and all that, they lose their revenue stream because they will be displaced out of the market.
Right.
It's now a question of philosophy of regulation. If I were the energy secretary, would I say, oh, if those guys will go bankrupt, but they don't affect ratepayers, but they might affect the banks or the depositors, they cannot repay their debt. Let them go ahead. They're taking a risk, all that. Or should it be the case that the Energy Secretary also looks at society as a whole and give guidance? Like, if the Treasury in the US had given guidance to the banks on this excessive subprime lending, we wouldn't have had a recession. So that's the question. That's a very likely scenario that at some point all these thermal power plants will become stranded assets, and someone will suffer. Our job in ICS is to make sure, first of all, that when that time comes, it will not be to the account of the ratepayers and taxpayers. But still, we see as part of our role is, we advise these power developers, the banks, about the stranding risks.
Right.
What's your second question?
Well, I mean, the question was really about kind of like the an optimistic reading of what might lie ahead, and to a realistic kind of view, and if there's a difference between the two. I guess the question goes in the same direction as kind of, if you look at it from a, on a global scale, will we be able and will the as a, in the world, and the Philippines is as a small part of it, will we be able to kind of keep global warming at the objectives that we've set ourselves, to keep it below 2 degrees or not? And
well, yeah. If, all the press reports we read tell us that no country is actually on track to abide by its Paris commitments.
Right.
In the Philippine case, because we also work with the Climate Commission and we advise them technically on the nationally determined contributions. So in the NDC that we submitted in 2015, it was the so-called 70% reduction by 2030 from the baseline scenario. Unfortunately, all the measures that were identified were made conditional in implementation, conditional on foreign assistance.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So a study for the Climate Commission outputted what the economists call a marginal abatement cost curve, which ranks mitigation measures according to net cost. And so when we examined that study, we found that there are actually measures that don't entail an incremental cost, but in fact have negative cost, which means that private sector agents should be doing this by themselves if the financial return is attractive enough, right? So that's why we were asking the Commission, why are all these conditional when we can do it?
Right.
Then secondly, and those measures that were still identified as conditional were actually things that were already being implemented. So it's funny.
Okay.
So we're helping the Commission improve our NDC submission for 2020. So that's it.
Okay. So, but again, like different components, right? So on the one hand, I mean, when it comes to the renewable energy part, as regards trying to achieve the commitments that were made as part of the Paris Agreement, different. So yeah, one part is of course the idea, that renewables here really make sense. I mean, like it's an island nation, you have. And where would you? And you have sun, of course, all the time. Where would you like to work with renewables if not here in the Philippines? No.
Well, yeah, we always look at we're always looking out for the low-hanging fruit.
Exactly.
And one of those is solar rooftops. So under the Renewable Energy Act, there's this so-called net metering program.
Yeah.
Let me just explain it in detail for the benefit of others. So you have a solar rooftop, you have solar panels that generate electricity, and then depending on your household demand, there will be times that your generation will be in excess of what your demand is.
Right.
But the net metering program provides that excess energy will be fed into the grid and paid for, right? So almost all the financial models about the cost of solar panels, your rooftop configuration, all that, tell us that installing solar panels on your roofs is really a very attractive financial proposition. However, since the net metering program was launched in 2013, after 6 years, we only have a minuscule installation rate of 20 mega.
Okay,
20 megawatts.
How's that? How come? I mean, what's that?
So that's our job to investigate. In the first few years, a lot of bureaucratic procedures that had to be fine-tuned, permitting process, and in 2013, maybe 2013, as compared to now, prices of solar panels were 2 times what they cost now. But then we also found out that, you know, even the people who can really afford the investment, you ask them, are you aware of this program? Oh, well, I heard of it, but, you know, I don't really know.
Okay.
So it's really an information problem as well. So, but in Cebu, my siblings all have solar installations. And then one of my sisters has been pestering me because she's having difficulty getting the net metering contract with the utility. That's the Viking Electric company, but her solar panels are already operating. And you know, in Cebu, unlike here in Manila, the analog meters are bidirectional.
Okay.
So when you are producing excess energy, the meter goes back. But in the net metering program, you are required to install 2 unidirectional meters.
Okay.
One is will measure your imports from the utility. One, your net exports to the grid. And my sister was asking me, because she doesn't have this net metering agreement yet. She was told by the installer that, Madam, you should install a load limiter. What is that? Oh, you know, that will just curtail your exports to the grid so that the meter won't move back. So, but actually that's a bad proposition because you will decrease your savings. And then she argues, you know, but the engineer said this and said that. Well, believe what you want to believe, but the thing is that the net metering application takes a long time. So, in Cebu, a year.
Okay.
I think the baccalaureate there was the city hall, not the utility.
Wow. So is it kind of fair to say that we have the law in place and we also have the technology, but somehow the implementation is what the problem is? I mean, like.
Yeah, I think it's information. That's why we have written to the Energy Regulatory Commission to compel the utilities to educate all the ratepayers about this program.
Okay.
Which they haven't done. I mean, it's such a simple idea.
Yeah. Okay, and so, I mean, like, in Germany, if I just think about the situation there right now, I mean, one problem is also that the grid needs to be upgraded quite a bit if you want to, I mean, in the case of Germany, if you want to use wind that you're generating in the north, and you want to transport it through all of Germany, you need to really upgrade your grid, no? And that's of course quite costly. But I mean, the question is here: how about the grid, and how, of course, related to that, also the question of the a couple of monopolies that are controlling the energy market as well. Are they having their thumb on the grid as well? I mean, like how does this dynamic? How is that working out?
Well, maybe next year or after the year after next, we will the Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao grids will be fully integrated. There is ongoing installation of a submarine cable from Cebu to the Zamboanga Peninsula.
Okay.
It's about, I think, just 400 megawatts, but that's enough for the trade.
Okay.
The problem after we reformed the power sector was that before there was a central plan. You would plan simultaneously your least cost generation expansion program along with the transmission expansion plan simultaneously. Now that we have all these independent power producers and a privately run transmission system, it's a concession controlled by China and some local capital. It appears that the transmission plan is not really very friendly to where renewables are.
Okay.
So that's one thing that we can address. We work closely with Senator Sherwin Gatchalian, who chairs the Energy Committee. So we're always in discussions with him on what needs to be done.
I mean, you just made an offhand remark, like that China is controlling also the national grid to a large extent. So what's going on there? Maybe you can explain that in more detail.
Take the whole day. It's a long history. The one that owns that business now, that is the concessionaire, is no longer the original bidders. Transfers of ownership, and at that time we still did not have this Philippine Competition Commission to look into what happened. So I don't know. I think that concession still has 17, 18 years to run. So all we can do right now is to encourage the Department of Energy to assume more oversight.
Okay. Yeah, I see. So okay. So if we take all of this together, I mean, like you mentioned also that you're working closely with Senator Gatchalian. He was also in Germany with a delegation and studied the Energiewende there. The shift to renewable energy in Germany, and hopefully that had some kind of positive impact on him, because one, I don't know if funny is the right word, but one, probably rather odd observation was that they were including him at some point, considering using nuclear facilities here in the Philippines also for power generation, right? So, which I think after the senator went to Germany got a little bit shelved, if I'm not mistaken. But long story short, so the idea is, working with people like Win Gatchalian and, raising awareness among decision makers and the general population is part of kind of bread and butter also for people like you do, right? But then, again, the question is how efficient is that at the moment? I mean, what do you think in the next 10 to 15 years? Will we see any breakthroughs here, really? Or will we still be relying on coal when we're talking, I don't know, in 10 years?
Well, the main utility in Meralco, its power generation subsidiary, have these long-term projections where they, it's like they run simulation, given projected demand and given expected cost of all the technologies. And turns out MGen, this generation company, say, well, in 2030, it will still be something like 60% coal.
Right.
But then there are some problems with this data.
Okay.
But at least the encouraging part there is that the economics people in the utility are aware of the Paris Agreement. They're aware about, they are not climate deniers.
Right.
And they're just saying, best case, if you want reliable power, is coal.
Right.
But that simulation also said the next dominant technology is solar. But I think the guys did not really use the best available data on solar and batteries. In fact, that simulation neglected batteries outright. Yeah.
So what you're saying is also on the on the side of the government, there is also some kind of shortcomings just in terms of reading or relying on the latest research and kind of really figuring out what the potential of RE is. No, I mean, is there? That's what I hear. I mean, like, is it like that? Basically, that some decision makers are not very well informed, and that they can, or does that? I mean, does that ring true? Senator Gatchalian, I mean, like, does he fully understand?
He's a very bright guy. Yeah, he's a very bright guy. That's why when he thought about giving up the energy chairmanship, he said, "No, don't give it up," because then the guy that would replace will have his own learning curve, and
So what? And if that's the case, what can somebody like Gatchalian do? I mean, how much transformative potential does do his initiatives have, really?
Well, it also depends on the new composition of the Senate now.
Right.
And then we were all surprised during the State of the Nation address that President Duterte suddenly mentioned, "I admonish the Department of Energy to accelerate the transition away from coal."
Right.
And into RE. So we don't know where that came from.
Okay.
But after that, a few days after that, Secretary Kusi was already quoted in the press saying, "Yeah, I will heed that." So let's see. On Friday, Tim Guanzon, the energy person of Senator Gatchalian, she will visit her office,
Okay.
and we will discuss the legislative agenda on energy for the senator.
It's interesting. I mean, like one thing that that always strikes me is like what I think is very important to Gatchalian is this whole issue of energy security, right? I mean, to me, it's always a bit ironic that I get it, the idea, that, or the fear that if you rely too much on RE, that you will have some kind of, that you won't have all the energy you need all the time when you need it. No, that's kind of the fear. And now I think that this is not really the case if you look at the latest, research. But then also, what strikes me as kind of a strange idea is that, I mean, in terms of energy security, if you're importing all of your coal or most of it, as is actually the case here, right? Then, I mean, also from a, geostrategic point of view, it doesn't strike me as necessarily the best strategy. No, what do you think?
Well, isolate energy security from reliability. The reliability part, there's a little truth to that because of variability and battery storage cost. But security part, you're right. Rely on RE compared to imported stuff. Open to price fluctuations and foreign exchange risk. So in general, if you can put a metric to security, then RE would win, hands down, right?
So how come this hasn't been like, that this argument hasn't really been taken up stronger by people like Gacha, yeah.
Yeah, because when we restructured the power sector, people were so fed up with the state's role in energy, right? So we had this pendulum swing to the least interventionist policy as possible.
All right.
So you let private agents do their stuff. I mean, if I were Meralco or MGen, why would I care about these geopolitical risks? It's not my problem.
Sure. Okay, let me zoom out a little bit again. What I hear is like what's needed is a lot of very informed input for policymakers and also the general population from people like you, people who can really get to the details and make fact-based arguments as to why we should be getting more into RE here in the Philippines. But there's of course also this larger global awareness, that climate change is a big danger, and this is something that we can only really, fight together. If you look, for example, in Europe, especially in Germany right now at the moment, the Green Party is the strongest actually, and is kind of a general trend, that people put that at, that voters put this concern about climate change at the top of their list, and even parties like the Conservatives have to really take account of that. So there's some kind of shifting mindset, I would say. Then you have initiatives in the United States from progressive politicians, that want to start a new Green Deal, those kind of ideas that have been around for some time, and that get more and more popular. And then thirdly, you also have young people, advocates, thinking of the Swedish girl Greta Thunberg, who's been very influential in Germany. You had a strong following, those Fridays for Future thing where students will be protesting. It's a very influential, kind of grassroots movement. Now, my question to you would be, where do you see, how is this playing out in the Philippines? Are millennials, for example, as concerned here as they are in, let's say, Germany or the States? And does this play a role when it comes to elections or not really?
A few years back, there was a survey on climate change awareness. And that returned very high numbers of awareness, but from very different perspectives about how it affects them, but there's low awareness about renewable energy.
Okay.
But to answer your question more forthrightly, we have to admit that in the Philippines there are no well-defined political parties, except for the left of center party list types. And there's also no green vote. So you don't hear during elections candidates running on a climate change action platform. So I think it's just also a part of our stage of development as a country. But we should not preclude change. That might change. It depends on partly millennials, and maybe given more evidence of climate change. After Typhoon Haiyan, there was a surge in interest.
Well, it makes sense,
Yeah. And by the way, we also have field projects in those Haiyan hit areas, ICSC.
But you would still say it's kind of an awareness issue. I mean, like you said.
It's also an economics issue.
Okay, so people simply have other problems. So they have more pressing problems. So if you can't get food on the table, then you won't worry about what's going to happen in 10 years or something. sadly.
Economics, but it's also awareness because they don't know what they don't know. That even now, the slow onset impacts of climate change already affecting agricultural harvest,
Yeah.
health.
Yeah, I mean that would exactly. So and also like that would be like one thing that I'm very interested about is like the potential also of RE for the economy here, right? I mean, like if you think about other sectors, like I don't know, like the business process outsourcing, call center type of work that probably will get, replaced by some artificial intelligence solution at some point in the future. But then, maybe in the field of RE, this could be a very promising sector for new jobs. No, isn't that also? Again, to me, it sounds like there's many different angles as to why RE is such a promising thing here, but you don't really hear that being stressed enough, I think,
Yeah, okay, that's our job.
Yeah,
So, as you know, I'm also chairman of this center that's also partly supported by you.
Yeah.
And we actually have projects to increase awareness levels, a campaign on net metering, and all that. We're awaiting the so-called distributed energy rules from the Energy Regulatory Commission. Because once those rules are promulgated, this potential, all the solar rooftops can be utilized very efficiently. You can have microgrids, mini grids, even within the franchise area of the monopoly.
Right.
So we're waiting for these rules to come out.
Okay.
And then we will campaign.
That's good. And I mean, the center, you just mentioned this newly founded think tank, or think and do tank, I should say. What is the agenda there? Can you talk a little bit about your work in this context?
Well, as I already mentioned, one of the things is we really have a direct campaign effort on net metering.
Okay.
We'll hold seminars and invite installers. And it's one. And we have all this standing policy committee that engages government and regulators. Then we have this field program where we will directly support RE installations by local government units. We have this criterion called first of a kind FOA.
Okay.
Because there's so many installations already in the small island grids and off-grid areas. And since we have very limited resources, it has to be the case that any center intervention will meet that criterion. It has to be something that has a very distinct added value to what others have already done. So I think I'll stop there.
I see. Well, okay, so then maybe one last question to you. Now get the power to really shape policy here in the Philippines. What, let's say you were the president or, in some similar role, what would your priorities be?
The RE Act as it stands just deserves minor tweaking and then have it fully implemented.
Okay. So basically some tweaking of the screws and then just basically implement what's already there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think a competitive marketplace will, in the medium to long run, coal will just should die.
Yeah. So, well, I guess then the overall question would be, is it going to be soon enough or is it going to be too little too late? I mean...
That's what everyone's asking.
That's what everyone's
I don't know the
asking.
answer.
Yeah. Anyway, you're trying your best to speed things up, no?
Yep.
Make things happen as soon as possible. Well, Viking, it was very informative, very knowledgeable. Thank you very much for this conversation. I wish you best of luck for your advocacy and other work, and I'm sure we will talk again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity as well.
Thank you.
When people put up power plants, you don't
It's
look
cheaper.
at, yes, you look at the levelized cost.